And here comes a very important part of our Congress, the panel that touches on the central topic of our Congress, electrification of the economy. We will have a discussion to get to know the developments that have come from the real sector to electrify their energy efficiency. We will look at different initiatives in the businesses like the self-generation electrification of transportation projects. What are the progress and the advance and the developments that are coming up in the short and middle term? From the academia, we will have Mrs. Ana Cecilia Escudero, Chief Authority in Research in Medellin's Pontificia Universidad Bolivariana. She's a mechanical engineer with a master's degree in energy systems and a PhD in engineering, more than 20 years in research and teaching and consulting in the topics of energy. She's a partner at MinCiencias, and she has a patent of invention in Colombia, the United States, and Mexico, the system for generating electrical energy from low-speed wind energy by means of two systems of drive blades. And today, she's also the Director of Research and Transfer at UPB. And at last, it's important to underline that Dr. Escudero belongs to the program Colombia Científica Energética 2030, one of the biggest scientific initiatives in the history of science in Colombia. Also with us, we have the Commercial Vice President for Infrastructure and Natural Resources at Bancolombia, Maria Juliana Morazaria, a business administrator from La Sabana University with an MBA from the Institute of Business Institute, IE, in Bancolombia. She has been a corporate account manager and a corporate bank area manager. We also have Dr. Sandra Manrique, a partner of energy, mining, and natural resources at Felipe Pedro Carrizosa, Ferrero DU, and Uria. She's a lawyer from Universidad Libre de Colombia with a specialization in residential utilities at Universidad Externada de Colombia, specialized in labor law from Universidad Libre in Colombia, and of course in the management of portfolio and financial risk in the industry of natural gas from Alberta School of Business, Edmonton, Canada. She also has an LLM in commercial law from University Francisco Victoria in Madrid, Spain, and a degree in international management of the oil and gas businesses from Los Andes University. We also have the Vice President of Procurement and Sustainability, Diana Valencia, an industrial engineer specialized in procurement management, more than 18 years of experience in different areas in the supply chain in companies of mass consumption, and more than 13 years of work for Bavaria. At last, we also have the Director of Electricity for Incauca, Harold Holm. Harold Holm is an electrical engineer and an electric engineer with a master's degree in business administration. He has developed his professional experience in the Colombian sugar sector for more than 15 years, especially in the area of cogeneration and manufacturing, where he has been the head of the electric department, including the areas of electric plant, electric maintenance, instrumentation, and control. In the last 2 years, he has been part of the development and commissioning of the expansion of the cogeneration project in Incauca. The panel will be moderated by the former Minister of Mines and Energy and today's Director of CRE, Tomás González. He's an economist from Los Andes University with a PhD from in economics from London University. He was a Minister of Mines and Energy, Vice Minister of Mines and Energy, a Deputy Director of the Planning National Department. He was the Deputy Executive Director for Colombia in the International Monetary Fund, and he has belonged to in different boards of directors, Ecopetrol, ISAGEN, the Private Competitiveness Council, different regulatory councils, and he has also been a professor of economics in Colombia and abroad, and he teaches energy economics at Los Andes University today. So we want to welcome them all, and I give the floor to the panel moderator, Tomás González.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Acolgen, for such an interesting conference and this timely forum for the challenges that we're living when it comes to energy. This panel has a specificity, and that is that this is one of the opportunities in which we can talk to the different players of the energy chain. And along these lines, as an introduction, I would like to put some data on the table in order to start our dialogue on electrification. I think that the starting point is the fight, the struggle of the world against climate change, against global warming. It goes through decarbonizing the economy. The world has a very strict agenda when it comes to decarbonization, and that obviously goes through electricity. So, as we know, Colombia has a very clean energy matrix. Most of our electricity is generated with renewable, mainly with water, and that has been an energy matrix for a long time. Nevertheless, if you take a look at the energy consumption that Colombians have, we realize that 2/3 of the energy we consume comes from fossil fuels, gasoline, diesel, coal, natural gas, GNL, LNG, and that is where we have our first struggle against climate change. A country such as ours with clean electricity, but it has a fossil consumption, and this needs to change. And these changes are going to go through electrifying the economy. What does it mean? Electrifying the economy means passing most of the energy consumption and of having the production that could back it up. So the idea is for this consumption to be of low emissions. The government has set ambitious goals. The government said that by 2030 they want to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of the consumption sector. They want to reduce it in 51%. That's by 2030, and the intention is that by 2050 we are going to be net zero target. We are here with people from the bank, from the industry, from the academia, people who are studying regulation and the law in order to study the implications of this electrification, which is something that we have to eventually put in place. Let us start with the industry. And we have two guests who are going to talk to us about food and beverages, about the sugar industry. Let us start there, Diana. Let's start with you. What does it imply for a sector such as yours, that of food and beverages, for the industry, the energy transition, the electrification? What does it imply in practice when you are told, no, let's electrify, let's move to the energy transition? What does this imply on a daily basis? Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Acolgen for this invitation, and my greetings to all the panelists. That this is a challenge that we have as an industry against global warming. And yesterday it was mentioned by Federico Echavarria in his intervention, where he was saying that unconventional renewable energy will back up the growth of the lack of energy that we'll see in the coming years. And as a private company, we have an active participation in this growth, because even though we are large consumers, we are also committed with that agreement signed by the government, the Paris Agreement, in the reduction of different emissions. At Bavaria, and in our group, for a long time, we have been working in 5 sustainable fronts. We are not speaking of sustainability as an independent topic, as a topic that is not ours. We're saying that sustainability is our business. I remember some years ago, I was in this forum talking about our plans, and it's great to see that many of these plans are already a reality. So speaking about those specific plans that have to do with climate action, we are seeking that 100% of our energy will come from renewable sources, and we are aiming at reducing in 25% greenhouse gas emissions along our value chain. As Tomás said, this is not an easy task. It is quite a challenge for us. What have we done? We are making investment in different aspects. For example, we are doing in a boilers conversion. This month we are going to commission in our Boyacá brewery, one in which we are moving from coal to natural gas. Another front in which we are working deals with our emissions, because at Bavaria more than 18% of the emissions come from our distribution operation. So that is an item that we have to tackle, and we are committed to working in that reduction. We are incorporating electric vehicles in our logistics, and the idea is to have them of a large capacity. We have worked with in Colombia with other actors in order to make this a reality. At present, we are in a pilot phase. We are converting the trucks. They're operating in Medellin and Bogotá, and the idea is to continue incorporating to the extent possible more vehicles to our fleet in order to have a revolution in Colombia's logistics. Well, thank you, Diana. Harold, in the sugar industry, obviously you produce sugar and related products, and you are also in the biofuels business. Many of these industries are in biofuels, but you are consumers of fossil fuels. As Diana said, when a company such as yours bets on the energy transition, how are the internal decision-making processes? It is interesting for those who are listening to us to understand what does it mean to change a boiler, as Diana was saying. Can you please share that information with us? In Cauca. In Cauca, we belong to the sugar sector, to the Colombian sugar sector. We have an advantage. For example, if we want to take a look at the sector under the definition of Michael Porter related to competitiveness and to all the aspects that gather in an industry for it to be considered a cluster. If you start analyzing each definition, we see that the sugar sector complies with many of them. And the sugar industry has quite an advantage, and that is that we have research centers that are constantly aiming and optimizing the use of resources that are part of our productive chain. That's the case of Cenicaña and Tecnicaña. So, given the guidelines that we have socialized this within our company at Incauca. The energy transition started a long time ago. I've been working here for more than 15 years, and we have had the opportunity of working with energy efficiency processes at the different levels of the industry of our plant. I can mention that 5 or 7 years ago, we started engine electrification process. We changed them from turbines to electric engines, and we came up with a new evaporation system which aims at energy efficiency in the cooking sugar process. I can mention other projects that are based on energy efficiency. And I'm proud of saying that during the past 2 years, we have been working on increasing our cogeneration. This is a daily bet aiming at sustainability, and at the same time we contribute to the country's development. For 2 years, we have worked on cogeneration. Cauca was the first cogenerator in Colombia that started distributing energy products. We are still doing so, and with this project, we are aiming at having a 4-fold increase of our energy supply to the public grid. This is a plan of 10 megawatts per hour in its dispatch, and with this project, we are seeking around 40 megawatts hour. That based on a technological update in our boilers, in spite of the fact that we have been working in other fronts of the plant, we wanted to take this last leap, and it's to change the pressure system from a low pressure system to a high pressure system, and it gives us that energy efficiency that we are aiming at.
Muchas gracias, Harold. Ana,
thank you, Harold. Anna, your advantage is that you can see this from the academic standpoint. You have conducted a related technical analysis. Please tell us, how do you see the effort made by the industry in Colombia? What's the potential that you're envisioning? For example, if we take a look at the data of UPME, and you see many potential for these changes and benefits with energy transition. How is the industry going? Is it going faster than expected? Well, good morning. I want to thank Acolgen for this invitation. I want to greet the other members of the panel. We have done research and we have coached the industry for a long time. Actually, during my first years as an engineer, I worked with Diana conducting the energy potential analysis at Bavaria, and it's mainly related to energy consumers, and the idea is to be in an avant-garde position, whether it is in technological development in order to have improvements in energy efficiency, and also the overall integrated management of energy, for example, operational variables, best practices in the use of energy. So I will say that in the country there is an important and significant effort, and I also would like to put on the table that when we speak about electrification, it was just mentioned in Colombia, we have a very clean energy matrix. However, we must not lose sight of the way in which we are generating energy. We can migrate to a higher level of conversion in certain technologies of electrical energy. And later on, I'm going to mention the household sector. And the idea is to see where is this energy coming from. I think that there are a lot of improvement opportunities when it comes to transportation. It is clear that the best potential we have to mitigate climate change is there in the transportation sector, and also to change some consumption patterns in the industrial and household sectors, adopting systems and technology that will enable to move forward in that area. So that's the view of the academia, to have the necessary tools to facilitate this process to the industry. Anna, how do you see the process implemented by the industry? How optimistic are you regarding the speed with respect to the targets set by the government? When it comes to generation, it is significant to have an increase in self-generation, mainly with renewable energy. Many of these companies are using certain models for self-generation. The projects, as Harold mentioned, of technological improvements, high-pressure boilers, gasification systems, they have a more thermal cut, but there is also an important increase there. We know that the support and the contributions of 1715 have dynamized this exercise. We still have a long way to go. I think that we're lagging behind when it comes to the implementation of everything that has to do with measurement, and to have a closer follow-up and characterization. And the idea is for the industry to have a more active response when it comes to demand. I think that when it comes to generation and generation with renewables, technological improvement and the implementation of energy management systems, at least with respect to large customers, has been quite significant and has been sustainable in time. The sector has an important role in every single front, and most likely will need to continue working with SMEs.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you.
Ahora, María Juliana,
Now let's ask María
sentada en
Juliana.
Bancolombia, tú estás
You are
teniendo
in
relaciones
Bancolombia.
con todos los clientes
You
que están
have
tratando de
relationships with all the
electrificación, de sacar
customers that are
adelante los procesos
working
de
on
modernización. ¿Por qué
electrification,
no
on
nos cuentas primero
modernization?
cómo se ve desde el sector
Please
financiero
tell us,
este cambio
how
en
do you see
electrificación,
this
este
electrification
impulso que están
change in the
empezando a coger la
financial sector,
transición
this
y cuáles son los
momentum
puntos
related
críticos
to
que
the
ves ahí?
transition, and which are the critical points you envision? Well, good morning to each and every one of you. Special greetings to the panelists, to Tomás, and I would like to thank Acolgen for this invitation. I think you're touching on a very important point. Bancolombia for a long time has been working on the energy transition, and this is aligned to the 17 objectives set by United Nations. I do not think it is an easy process. The first thing we did at the Bancolombia group was to identify those large sectors that we must coach and that to those that we must advise, and we should make them aware about the transition process of the industry. And this requires many specific actions for the organization. And we have 4 items that are very important for our customers, but with the coaching and with the knowledge in the energy sector, we know that we are going to achieve the proposed objectives. The first one is to consolidate a strategy that will be focused on that sustainable funding, that they will be aligned with those green lines, and not only regarding energy projects, because here we're talking about unconventional renewable energy, but this also applies for the household sector, for construction, for the agribusiness, for the industrial sector, where today we have an exposure, and we must be aware and respectful with the operation. We have obtained these resources through bonds issuance. That's for the amount of 1.5 billion, and they are part of renewable energy and sustainability projects. Moreover, we have to take into account environmental and social risk in over 1,300 projects that are aiming at funding them, and also informing about the standards. I think that we have important challenges to be achieved in the short term. We have a transition process aligned with the government by 2030 that most likely will not be enough to reach this by that year. So we need to coach them in that area. So it's important to coach these processes and to take them to a cleaner, renewable energy and firm for Colombia.
suficiente estos plazos cuando no será suficiente? ¿A qué te
Yeah,
refieres?
when you say that perhaps we're not going to attain this by 2030, I think that there are companies here, and you mentioned it, Tomás, and yesterday it was mentioned by Federico. There are companies like thermal plants that will need to back up energy in Colombia, and we cannot stop coaching them, and we cannot stop participating in these operations. I think that we need to have much clarity about the energy matrix in Colombia. Today, we have coached the 2019 auction, which was very beneficial, and we are in the process of developing these projects. We are funding 500 megas, not only wind energy, but other types of renewable energy. And to the extent that these companies will participate in this process, we'll have also the current companies that provide that firm energy to Colombia. We say 2030 as the year in which we want to attain this. But obviously, we ask ourselves if we are going to comply with this by 2030. I know that it's a very slow process.
No sé si les está pasando a
I
todos,
don't know
pero
if it's happening to everyone, but the sound is very difficult. There is a background noise. I don't know if everybody is seeing the same thing. Could the technical people, could they help us with that? Because while Maria Juliana was speaking, it was very difficult to understand what she was saying. I mean, I wasn't able to understand what Maria Juliana was saying. Well, now let's talk about those and your answers, that they are part of the core of this process. I want to ask Sandra, who is always interacting with customers of all the chain, and in addition to this, she interacts with the regulator, with the government, that regulatory outlook, which is so important on your side, Sandra. How are you seeing the progress towards transition, electrification, decarbonization, and how do you think we're doing with respect to that? Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Acolgen, Tomás, and the other members of the panel. I have a more critical outlook from the standpoint of the government targets, from the productive sector or the sector to develop the projects. Tomás, if you base these projects on renewable energy, we are speaking about a more stable and consolidated regulatory framework and of integrated energy sources to the grid. For example, if we are speaking about the energy plan 2050 from 2020 to 2050, as to energy transition and energy efficiency, I think we're lagging behind when it comes to the regulatory framework. I think that the most important thing as to decarbonization in fuels, electromobility, future fuels, and we know that the government is conducting the studies, but we need a framework that is not only of incentives. I'm not saying that we have poor incentives, but we do need clear rules of the game where the roles of everyone are clearly defined. So if you're talking about self-generation with renewables for the productive sector, we have multiple initiatives, large companies working on this. I do agree that's more of large companies than SMEs, and they have a regulatory framework. But if I'm going to speak about electromobility, we are lagging behind. Today, we do not have a framework that says what's an electroliner, if it's a public service or not. And until last month, we have the first draft on its regulation. It's not criticism. I'm just just trying to say that those plans must be implemented. We do not have mandatory standards for vehicles in the country or standards for the import of electrical vehicles in the country. We do not have a set of standards or rules that will help the energy transition when it comes to transportation. The most important potential in energy efficiency is transportation, and that requires rules not only in our sector, that of mining and energy, but also in the transportation sector. Standards that need to be mandatory. We have started a transition in transportation hand in hand, not only with the blend with biofuels, which have a strong and robust framework, but in addition to the transition to natural gas that, started very strongly because there was a coordination of all the agents of the natural gas change that has been lost because the regulation is not helping with incentives in the sale of natural gas under different conditions. So we are in a market game where increasingly our vehicle natural gas loses space or opportunity with respect to gasoline, with respect to electromobility. We need to have the mechanisms that we have had in the past enhanced, but we need to have a clear framework. We're not seeing it in electromobility nor in hydrogen. By far, we have nothing regarding hydrogen in Colombia. So we are indeed lagging behind compared to what other countries have done with respect to hydrogen. We do not know how these energies are going to be integrated to the national interconnected system, if it's going to be a net zero source. So I'm always asking for that, because I think that legal security is indeed very important. But what we are facing today with respect to energy transition, not when it comes to renewable, because when it comes to renewable, we are ready with respect to certain things. We require a regulatory framework for the dispatch of plants and for other things that are being managed by CREC, and we know that that's the responsibility of the regulator, and most likely they're going to launch that regulatory framework pretty soon. But for other topics, we do not have a clear policy. That is, we are going to encourage electromobility, or, for example, in large cities, we cannot have a full electromobility. And that's very strange, Tomas, because in this sector, the development has arrived hand in hand with the industry more so than with the regulatory framework. So we are like in this journey trying to build what we're having. We have mass transportation of passengers with electricity, feeders with electricity, but we do not have a framework for that. So my topic is that security and investment requires not only an incentive regulation, but more stable regulations.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra. I think that we have different elements regarding the regulation, regarding what the industry is saying. I would like to go back to Bavaria and to Incauca to ask Harold and Diana the following. You think that with the efforts being made, efforts that have required internal change dynamics, I mean, how difficult is to see the compliance of the target that we have for 2030. Sandra has talked about transportation. More than 40% of the country's energy consumption is for transportation, but industry accounts for 25%. So between the two of them, it's 2/3 of energy consumption. With the efforts being made, do you think that's enough? Are you going to require developments that implies a higher use of fossil fuels for energy, or are you ready to say, no, we are ready to go with low-emission energy sources? Let's start with Harold, and then we'll give the floor to Diana. I believe that the effort is never going to be enough with respect to the government's goal to reach as soon as possible to net zero target. These are very ambitious targets, and in order to attain them, it's going to be necessary to have more commitment, more aid on the side of companies. As was previously mentioned, I would like to say that in Cauca has always been seeking that balance, more so now when we have other instances that are monitoring, for example, the carbon footprint, emissions, consumption. To that extent, it is necessary, for example, if we extrapolate all this to the rest of the industry, it is necessary to make additional efforts, additional motivations, because these are ambitious targets, and we are running out of time because we didn't start before. Now, with respect to Incauca, I believe that with this last leap in our connection project, we are very close to attain our target, but when we analyze the carbon footprint, we see that around 60% is related to cogeneration, and also as part of the total productive chain, there is an important percentage related to agricultural input, and for example, the agricultural inputs, and we have to work on it in order to reach the goals. We need to work in a more expedited manner.
And let me ask you, Harold, when you were talking about these ambition to reach the goals, can you do it by yourselves in your industry, or will you need some additional support? Or is it best to think, or I'm sorry, is it best to think of having a longer term? In the specific case of Incauca, I think that we will make it on time. However, if you look at it from the sector's point of view, without looking at the detail of the different sugar mills, I think that there could be a lag, perhaps in the smaller ones. However, there are already sugar mills, not necessarily in Cauca, that are leading this initiative of becoming almost self-sustainable in terms of their fuels and energies. And they have very short-term goals, and they're doing very well. As I mentioned, and as I reiterated before, with this leap that we made for the expansion of cogeneration, we're taking a big leap, and that's exactly what we're seeking.
Diana,
what's your view? Tomás, undoubtedly, as a company, and I'm speaking for Bavaria specifically, our goals are very aggressive by 2025. As Harold mentioned also, as a big company, we believe that we will make it because a clear objective is that by 2025, 100% of our energy should come from renewable energy sources. And we have been discussing this for several years and working on that. We've been working on our project to install solar panels that, even though it's true will not be supplying 100% of our energy, will cover about 25% of our consumption in our beer plants. In parallel, we're working on other aspects in order to put solar panels in our distribution centers. But as you said, as a company, by ourselves, we will not be able to make it. We have been approaching the government, and going back to what Sandra said a moment ago regarding electrification of mobility, we've had to approach the government many times because, well, that's not everything, but at the end of the day, it's important to close other topics. So we have to go hand in hand with the government in order to achieve this, and we must unite efforts. But Thomas, an important point is that us, as a large company, have a commitment with the middle and smaller enterprises, because when we made the decision to make the investments that we made and to conduct pilot projects, for instance, with the electric vehicles fleet and the electric trucks, we also considered ways to help those middle and smaller companies that perhaps due to all the different restrictions have not yet decided to take that first step. So we went to middle and smaller companies and we made available to them electric vehicles to test them and realized that it makes sense for their business case and that what they see on paper in reality can be a good example of a good step towards sustainability in terms of mobility. So I think that as a large company, we can also help and promote conversion towards cleaner sources of energy in the middle to smaller enterprise bracket. Diana, which do you think will be the most important risks in achieving the goals? Of course, Bavaria is a big company and it has resources that many other companies in the sector have. But if you think bigger, what are the risks that you foresee that could be in the way of reaching the goals that you've set for yourselves? Where do you have to be very careful? Well, clearly, I think that the risks, the business cases are laid out under certain numbers and theories. So bringing these business cases to reality, in doing that, we have to be extra careful. That's why in many cases, we don't go with 100% implementations, but we prefer small steps with pilot projects in order to show what is set forth. So we have the backup of other operations that we have worldwide also that show that this is effective. So I think that this has been helpful for us, and the risk has to be very carefully measured when drawing the business cases for these projects. Thank you, Maria Juliana. And you just said a few moments ago that we also need to be able to have thermal developments. You said that we also need to have the backup of thermal projects. How do you foresee your client's reaction? What about the adoption of transition schemes? How quickly do you think they can happen? What barriers do you anticipate there? Do you think that this will work just because of that dialogue between companies and the banking sector? Or how do you foresee the development of those relationships? Thomas, I don't think that this is going to happen that quickly. It will take some time and it will be in the midterm. But part of the conversations that we've had, especially with the thermal and coal sector, we've been very direct in accompanying them in that transition process, in that change of their operation, which implies the development of studies and being clear of the consequences of these changes and how they will continue generating and having firmness in their supply in this operation. So I think that it won't happen too quickly. It will depend on the coaching that not only the financial sector can give them, but also technical people and engineers that are really knowledgeable of these processes. And of course, this will call for additional resources on the financial sector. Processes that need time. There are some that are being implemented more quickly and are being incorporated in their processes, like photovoltaic sources and different mechanisms that will not necessarily change the operation 100%, but that is the beginning of a transition process.
2023 a 2025, pues claramente será un reemplazo casi del
So
50%. Entonces yo
this
digo
will be gradually
que esto puede
replacing from
tomar
now till
alrededor de
2025
5
about
y 10 años, pero
25%.
que sí son
This will take
condiciones
between
donde
5 to
ustedes
10
están
years, I
conscientes
think.
y yo también nos hemos encargado de tener estas conversaciones o hacerlo oportuna, porque definitivamente no es una decisión hoy del gobierno nacional, es una decisión
This
hoy
is not a government's
de todo el
decision.
sector
It's the
financiero
decision
mundial,
of the whole
y
financial
también
sector.
en especial en el sector carbonero. Entonces yo sí digo que es un proceso de
So I
transición
think that
y
this will
nosotros
be a process of transition,
nos acompañar en ese proceso de transición.
and
Que
we will be
entendemos pues que
accompanying
no
them
es
in that transition process.
Tenemos momentos de muy buen audio y
Sometimes we
momentos en
can
que no
hear you
tuvimos
very
tan bien.
well, and
Pero
sometimes
quería hacerte
we
una pregunta
lose your
adicional.
audio.
Uno ya empieza a
But I
ver
have an additional
cuando
question.
habla
One begins to
de lo que está
see
ocurriendo con los bancos
when you
internacionales, con
speak of
quienes
what is
están
happening
manejando
with the
recursos,
international
empieza
banks
a ver
and resource
que se
managers.
cierra la
You start to see
financiación para
that
proyectos de carbón,
funding
por
is
ejemplo, y para
being
proyectos de
closed for
desarrollo
coal
de
projects
combustibles
and
fósiles.
developments of
¿Tú
fossil
ves
fuels.
eso ocurriendo en
Do you see
Colombia?
that
¿Tú
happening
ves
in
que puede
Colombia
empezar
too?
a haber un cuello de
Do you
botella
think that there
para
might be a
financiamiento de
bottleneck in terms
proyectos
of financing
que a
of
partir de combustibles fósiles lo
fossil
ves ocurriendo en corto
fuel-based
plazo? ¿Tú
projects?
ves
Do
que,
you
por
foresee
ejemplo, tu
that
junta
in the
directiva,
short
tus
term? Do
accionistas
you
te
see
digan,
that your
usted tiene que dejar de
shareholders
hacer
or
estos
your board of
desarrollos?
directors
¿O
is
ves eso
telling you have
pasando en
to
Colombia o
stop these
crees que no
developments?
va a haber
Do you see
problema para
that
estos
happening in
desarrollos?
Colombia, or do you
No,
think that
yo
there
sí
would be no
creo
problem for
que
those
viene
developments?
pasando y
Yes, I
ahorita lo
think that that's
mencionaba, la
already
banca
happening, and I
internacional, por
was mentioning
supuesto,
that
ha
already.
cerrado las
The
puertas,
international
pues
banks
definitivamente ha
have
tomado
closed their
medidas de
doors
pronto
or have
más
definitely
drásticas
adopted more
frente a este
drastic
tipo de
measures
industria.
vis-a-vis this type
Nosotros
of
en Colombia
industry.
estamos
Us in
desarrollando
Colombia
hasta ahora
are just
unas
beginning to
políticas claras
develop
frente a cómo
clear
los vamos a
policies.
acompañar. Hoy ya tenemos unas exposiciones importantes, como les
Today we
comentábamos
have
ahora,
important
y la idea
exposures.
no es definitivamente crear barreras en este momento en cuanto
The idea is not to create barriers
desarrollo y para todo el tema de la matriz energética. Yo creo
for the
que sí se va a
development of
dar
the
y
energy
esto
matrix as a whole. But I think that that will happen.
globales ya están tomando medidas similares a lo que pero no son medidas que vayan a cerrar
But
inmediatamente,
it's
son
not
medidas, como te digo,
measures that will
transicionales y que
close
nosotros debemos estar ahí y
these
acompañar
access
ese
to
proceso de
funding immediately.
transición.
These
Habrán
are
compañías que
transitional measures.
no tengan y son esas compañías a las que definitivamente tendrás que tener, digamos que mayores restricciones.
And you will
y
need,
aquellas que sí
or
las
you will
tienen,
have more
pues
restrictions.
definitivamente
And for
nosotros
those that have it,
hacerlo. Pero la verdad es que la banca internacional hoy ya tiene unas políticas claras.
well, today we already have clear policies. Us, as Bancolombia, have restrictions too, but we have to look at the long term. These are not measures to be adopted immediately. There will be a transition process, and we're willing to accompany them to the extent that they're ready to go down that pathway to
Cuando dices mediano
sustainability.
plazo, ¿qué
And
tan
when you
largo es
say
el mediano
midterm,
plazo?
how long, how far
diría
away is the
10 años.
midterm? I would think 10 years.
Muy bien, Ana. Pues hemos oído
I know.
lo que nos cuenta la industria.
We've heard from
Hemos
the
oído lo que
industry,
nos cuenta la banca.
we've heard from the
Y
banking
uno
sector,
pareciera entender,
and
pareciera
one
ver
would
que
seem
hay
to
dos
understand
mundos en
or
este
to see
tema
that
de
there are two
transición y de
worlds in
electrificación.
this topic
Uno
of transition
es
and
el mundo de las
electrification.
empresas grandes.
One world, the
Aquí
world of
tenemos
the
dos
large
empresas
businesses,
líderes
and we have
sentadas,
two
que
leading
nos están
companies
contando los
sitting here with
esfuerzos,
us,
que nos dicen,
telling about
Bavaria
their
nos dice,
efforts.
nosotros en
Bavaria tells
2025
us,
estamos
by
jugados por ser
2025,
completamente
we're
renovables en
betting
nuestra
on being
energía. Harold nos
completely
cuenta todo
energy
lo que están
renewable
haciendo pues, los
based.
ingenios, pero
And
también
Harold
nos
is
cuenta
telling
que hay
us
unos
about the
pequeños.
sugar mills, but he also says
¿Tú qué
that
ves?
there are some
¿Cuál es
smaller
el
sugar
camino? ¿Cuál
mills.
es la ruta
So which
para las
one,
empresas
what
medianas y
path
pequeñas
do
que
you see
también son
for the
grandes
medium
consumidores
to
de energía
small
fósil
size
y
companies
que
that are
tienen que ser un
also
jugador
fossil
fundamental
fuel
en la
energy
transición?
consumers and that have to be a fundamental piece in this transition? I think that the coaching that is made in the different associations to the medium and smaller industries, particularly in Medellin, for instance, with the cluster of sustainability of the Chamber of Commerce, there are programs in place for coaching these companies so that they are able to implement technological transition measures or measures that will not imply large investments towards energy efficiency. The Diana was mentioning a point that is very important regarding accompanying suppliers in their development. These companies play a very important role in that, and it would be fabulous that other companies could assume the same position that Bavaria has assumed in coaching their suppliers. We've seen these in other cases elsewhere, so this can be an interesting pathway. This coaching that can be offered from the different associations and from the different regions. Many times the problem is lack of resources, but anyway, there's an important pocket of resources that we have associated to science and technology, and that can perfectly be connected with energy transition projects in any sector, in any industry. So on that map, when priorities are set in terms of allocation of these royalty resources, I think that the different geographic departments should set as their priorities decarbonization, plus all the commitments implied in reducing emissions. We know that there are very specific actions in this regard, and many times what is lacking is resources, but also, as Sandra mentioned, the speed in which the regulatory entities act. We need to have very clear rules of the game. They are in the agendas, they are in the roadmap of the energy mission, but they're not happening, and it is difficult to make long-term decisions. So coaching provided by the big companies is important by prioritizing, or the government prioritizing the allocation of resources for this type of initiatives, and that they can hopefully speed up the bridging of gaps that we still have, so that we can work more intensely and we can quickly start speaking of achievements and reaching these goals. I also believe that 2030 is a complex goal to reach, especially in certain sectors.
Muy bien. Sandra,
Thank you, Sandra. You spoke a while ago of the regulatory loopholes and gaps, and you put your lens on mobility and transportation. You also refer to hydrogen. It's a technology that still looks far away, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to start setting the regulatory basis looking at that. So I have two questions for you. The first one, apart from transportation, what do you think are the most important gaps that need to be bridged? And the second question, in relation to this discussion, in that this can only stop at being a dialogue and an effort among private companies, from the public policy point of view, where do you think most of the interventions should take place?
No te oímos.
We're not hearing you.
Y ahora sí, sí. La frase de la pandemia, que no estás en mute. Bueno, dale.
You're on mute, the famous pandemic phrase. Well, let's talk about energy efficiency, which is where I see most of the gaps. As I said before, I won't be speaking about renewable sources, but the rational and efficient use of energy has a regulatory framework starting in 2001, and a number of standards and norms that are there, but that have not yielded the fruit that we were expecting. I think the technological update of the industries and the electric power sector, which has been, in fact, one of the issues identified by these missions as necessary for energy efficiency, have to materialize on actual standards and on a more realistic regulatory framework. Because we can say that, well, the large companies can do that within the framework that we have for renewables, right? Or in cogeneration. That's one thing. But to talk about having technological update of other industries without a clearly defined framework, I think that's one of the issues that show the slowest development. One of the topics 196 is something that we applauded, the resolution from UPNA 196, talking about tax incentives that Resolution 1715 established for energy efficiency. But we need a procedure. More specifically, we need a clear, rapid, actual mechanism that will allow companies to access tax incentives not for renewables, but for projects in their industry, in the sector of technological update, in order to become more efficient. We didn't have that. Now we have it since last year. And we had norms before that, as you can remember, but we're not there yet. We have not come to concrete terms with the actors regarding those benefits and how we should behave or act in that framework. I miss a regulatory framework as strong as the one that we have on renewables for a technological update of the industry, and also in the sector of electric energy for updating the different technologies. So we have to put our hand on our heart and say, yes, there are electric generation assets that should not be lagging behind. There's no reason to say it. I understand the need to have thermal plants and natural gas and coal, but there are assets that are really inefficient. They should not be there, and we have to be honest around the table and say these inefficient assets must be either updated or be out of the market, because these are assets that are only representing costs in our energy matrix. So I miss having that. And another aspect that I think is very relevant is the need to gradually close the regulation of the electric sector in order to see how the new energies will be built in. And as you said, hydrogen looks far away, but we have to start working on that already. But I would be looking at how to incorporate these new energies to the dispatch model that we have. How to incorporate those new energies. We don't have anything about that today. So let me repeat this. It's not just about incentives. I want to be clear. I'm not asking for everybody to have tax incentives, but at least to have a clear framework on energy efficiency. And also fuel substitution, hybrid vehicles. We are not seeing incentives yet so as to have electric vehicles in Colombia. So the question is, what have other markets needed, different from Colombia or similar to Colombia's market, for this to truly happen in Colombia? What do we need to have that? Besides our regulatory framework, will we need other types of incentives or processes so that there will be economic mechanisms that will build in or incorporate these vehicles in Colombia? What type of mechanisms, what type of incentives do you have in mind? Going back to the last things that you said. Okay, this is my letter to Santa Claus, as if we could just ask for these wishes. What I've always thought is of having a regulatory framework. The first one was for general mobility, or that's what we need. Now, as to whether there is a policy or not about electromobility and vehicle natural gas, and I'm saying this because it's coming and going in natural gas, many discussions about whether the massive passenger transportation system should use natural gas or electricity. Do we have enough gas reserves? Are we going to import gas? At what price for mobility? So I think that one of the topics that I would like to see happening is to have a policy in terms of mobility. Of course, low emissions or zero emissions, absolutely. But that's what we're missing. And the other topic that I would like to see happen is this. In the electric sector, how will technological update of electric energy generation be with plants that are inefficient? What about those inefficient plants? What about those central stations? Will they go and be part of the market or not? How will this model about plants will behave? If you have diesel plants or liquid fuel plants that are inefficient and costly, are they required or not? Are we overhiring load? Well, this all looking at being able to meet our plans in terms of reduction of emissions and energy transition, because it's not only regarding the energy price, but also looking at the energy transition. And another wish that I would like to have come true is for us to sit down and discuss that everything that implies technological change calls for help for the companies that need it. So the procedure for you to have access to those tax incentives or benefits in terms of technological update is this. This is the regulatory framework that you have to take into account for you to get those benefits. Because there might be companies that are doing that, and thank goodness we have in Colombia companies like the ones that we have here that do it out of their own conviction to reach goals. But there are others that cannot afford to do it, don't have the resources, and need those incentives, but it cannot be more expensive to go for the incentive than to go for the technological update that they need or the energy transition. I would ask them for that framework. And regarding electromobility, I feel kind of sad because we are not at par, at the same pace that other countries are in this. Why is it that an electric vehicle in Colombia costs so much? Why is it that we don't have a plan in place to make it compulsory or to help, or I don't know, to be able to have incentives when importing those electric vehicles? So again, one thing is the world of renewable energy sources. A few years ago, with Thomas also, we debated the world of renewable energies, but a very different thing is the world of energy transition, which in my view, we don't have the foundations to require this from the agents. If you don't have those frameworks of incentives clearly set, the question is what to do so that the agents will implement it without the need of having a straitjacket that will not be abiding by and that will not be taking us anywhere.
Muy bien, muy bien, muy bien. Fíjense que
Well, very well. Based on what Sandra has told us regarding not only regulation but also a lot of emphasis on electric mobility, based on that, I would like to ask all of you the same question so that very quickly you can give us your opinion. Do you think that transition means that we necessarily have to go through gas, or that for electric mobility and other cases we can go for that transition directly, moving to electricity and leaving gas much more quickly? Or do you think that gas is a fuel that needs to be here and that we will be having here in the long term? So if you will, we can start from the end consumer, we can start from the industry. Diana, your view. Tomas, in our case, we have both options. And I think that marrying the one or the other at this point, from my point of view, would not be the best choice. We're using gas in our primary transportation vehicles, and we've done very well. We haven't grown more because the infrastructure in the country does not allow us to grow more. So we've been introducing some specific updates to continue increasing our fleet. But as Sandra said, this has to do with infrastructure. If we had a backup at a national level, it would be much easier. Because for us, at the end of the day, these vehicles perform quite well. So since we don't have that, and knowing that we also have other opportunities, we are also going for electric vehicles. But in my view, we don't have to choose one or the other. It's a composition of both, guaranteeing that they're functional at a country level. So do you think that we need to have gas, right? That we need gas in the long term? Yes.
¿Tú qué opinas, Harold?
How about you, Harold? Well, if we go back to your question where you were describing Colombia's energy matrix, where the biggest component is of a renewable nature, fortunately, looking at ideal conditions, I think that the guideline should be to jump straight into electric mobility because regardless of us having or not having good gas reserves, we are using nonetheless a non-renewable source. However, considering what was just mentioned, we also have to be aware of the state of the art at which the country is in relation to each specific technology. We cannot deny that in gas, we are well ahead than in electric mobility. But hearing Sandra a few moments ago, if the country turned around either through regulatory frameworks or incentives so that we can take that straight leap into electric mobility, I personally believe that that's what the transition should be like, without having to go through an intermediate phase that will just be in the way of getting to our goal as quickly as we need. Well, your views would apply only to mobility, or would they apply to other industries in the economy, like your industry, for instance? Do you think that you can do without gas that quickly? Do you think that you can do without gas just that quickly in other industries or sectors as well? Well, let me reiterate this. You have to check the state of the art for each technology, because it's not so easy, as Sandra just said it. You have to put our hands on our hearts and say, well, this technology has these inefficiencies, and perhaps get to a point where we say that we have to do without them, or rule them out. But we have to have the possibility to ensure that energy resource through other technologies. We have to get to that point. However, it's not easy to be at that point, because we have to be very careful at weighing what is at stake, and we have to balance the whole chain very well, because if we're very aggressive with certain guideline, we may fall short or exposed in the energy consumption that we may be having 15 years from now. Anna, what would be your view?
Tomás, I think that there are other options in the basket. We still have an important potential to develop in biofuels, biomass, the topic on biogasification, all this is, it will depend on the sector, it will depend on the moment. I mean, to say that everything has to go through gas, no, I don't think that's the case. I think that there are easy solutions when moving to electrifying, but there are many other options on the table, mainly in our country when it comes to these topics. I just would like to mention what happened before 1992 with all the kitchens of the houses in Medellin. We all had electric stoves, and we didn't have any problem whatsoever. So after El Niño phenomenon, we all migrated to gas. Today, we are seeing again household appliances that work with electricity. In the case of Germany, we see a very important change in electrification for household use, and that is because you have excessive renewable generation, solar energy that can be used. So if I'm using solar energy, I can change the application. So it's not only gas, electricity, there are other alternatives, and it depends on the application. As Sandra mentioned, it will be necessary to have a clear roadmap when it comes to policies regarding which are the bets, which are the orientations, because I mean, it's like we keep moving on backwards, and that makes planning a bit more difficult. Maria Juliana, now. I share what has been said by the other panelists. It's not one thing or the other. I think that we need to take into account what's happening in the country and the investments that have been made.
ya tenemos para
So we
trasladar
have to see what we have today in order
tema
to make the transfer.
es muy difícil. Yo creo que
It is
tenemos que
very
convivir con las dos.
difficult.
Es un proceso
I think that we
que
need
se
to
tiene que dar
coexist
en el
with
tiempo.
both, and that is a
Y yo creo que
process
estoy alineada
that is going to
a
take place
Sandra.
in
Yo creo que
time, and I
nosotros
agree
aquí
with what
acompañamos todo el
Sandra
tema de
said.
transporte
We
y
are
que hemos
coaching
buscado la
mass
financiación
transportation,
para
and we have looked for the funding for electrical
cómo va a
buses.
ser
So
va a
we
ser
have to
realmente
see
cómo va a ser
how are
va a
we
ser
going to
y la
replace
entrada
the
de los
buses,
operadores o
and
operadores que
how are the
finalmente
operators
nos
going to
generan
work,
nos prestan el servicio.
and
Yo creo que el
those
piso en sí
that
funciona
provide the
relativamente
service.
claro, pero estoy de acuerdo con todos.
But
No
I
es uno ni
do
lo otro.
agree
Nosotros
with what has been
que
said.
obviamente
It's
tenemos
not
que
one
tener
thing or the other.
infraestructura y por supuesto los proyectos que vienen
And
hacia adelante
obviously,
y
we
que
have to
podemos
see
utilizar
which are the
para que además el
projects
gas
coming
sea
forward
algo para todos.
in order for gas to be something for
Muy bien,
everyone.
Sandra.
Sandra?
No, yo en materia de movilidad,
When it
te lo digo, yo
comes to
brincaría a la
mobility,
electromovilidad
I will
porque
go
creo
straight
que
to
la movilidad, pues digamos
electromobility
una política en
because
materia de
a
transporte
policy,
con
when
gas
it comes
natural
to
es ponerle
transportation with
peso
natural
a un
gas,
sector
is to put
como
a
el sector
weight on
del
a
gas natural
sector, as
que
is the
tiene
case
unos
of the
usos
natural
más
gas sector,
importantes en otros
which
sectores
has
y
more
que no
important
necesitamos un
uses in other
estrés, soy
sectors, and
súper
we
clara,
do
no
not
necesitamos
need a
estrés en la movilidad
stress
con gas, es
when it
decir,
comes to
no,
gas
no podemos
mobility.
estar dependiendo de las
We
reservas del
cannot
país
depend on the
y
country's
del gas importado y
reserves
si
and on
tenemos
imported
plantas
gas,
regasificadoras o no
and
para la
if we
movilidad del país
have or
cuando la
not
podemos hacer a mi juicio de
regasification
una manera
plans
más
for the country's
eficiente con energía
mobility,
eléctrica.
when we can
Entonces yo
do
no la
it
pasaría
more
por gas
effectively with
ya lo tenemos,
electricity. I
tampoco
will
tenemos una
not pass
infraestructura
it through
tan
gas.
robusta como decía
In
Diana en
addition
gas
to
natural,
this, we do not
pero
have
creo que la
such a
tenemos para lo que
robust
es
infrastructure
necesario
when it
hoy.
comes to natural
Pero
gas, but it
siendo
is
realistas, creo que
sufficient
nos
for what we need
podría,
today. But if we are
podríamos hacerlo
realistic,
mucho más
we
rápido
can
llegando con la movilidad
do it
eléctrica
faster
definitivamente.
with electric mobility.
Aún con los niveles de costos que enfrentamos hoy,
Even with the cost levels that we are
Yo
facing
creo que
today,
es que,
yes.
¿cuál es mi punto?
What's
Bueno, yo soy
my
abogada, o sea, que soy
standpoint? Well, I'm a
limitada en muchas de
lawyer,
esas
so
cosas,
I'm
pero
very
te voy a decir una
limited
cosa,
when it
creo
comes to
que lo
certain
peor es la
topics.
incertidumbre.
I think the worst
Si
thing
yo
is
le digo a Diana,
uncertainty.
bueno,
If
vuelva a
I
una flota
tell
totalmente a gas natural
Diana,
y no
okay,
le
let's have
garantizo un contrato de
a
gas natural
fully
de largo
natural
plazo,
gas fleet,
estaciones de gas natural
and then you
convenientes en
have
todas
to
partes,
contract
una autosuficiencia
compressed
donde ella
gas
pueda estar como lo que tenemos en combustibles
stations,
líquidos
like what we
para
have for liquid
transporte, que no podemos
fuels for
decir una mentira,
transportation,
yo no le estoy
because we
ofreciendo
cannot
mucho, le
lie
estoy
about it.
ofreciendo
I'm not
incertidumbre.
offering that
Yo
much.
creo
I'm
que la
offering an
incertidumbre en gas
uncertainty,
natural
and
es
I think that
costosa.
uncertainty
Creo
in
que es
natural
costosa.
gas is
Entonces
very
creo que
costly.
si uno tiene
So
que
I
pasar por
think
esa
that if you have to
incertidumbre,
go
donde
through
hemos
that
pasado,
uncertainty,
y
an
llegar
uncertainty
otra
we have
vez
gone
para
through
después ir
already,
a lo de energía
and then
eléctrica,
to go
creo que
back
la
to
apuesta de la
electricity,
política
then I
debería ser por
think that the
energía.
policy's bet should be on electricity.
tú decías hace un rato,
Sandra,
hablabas
you
de
were
la carta
saying
al
not
niño
too long
Dios.
ago, you were talking
El
about
gobierno se va a sentar
the
ahora a final de
letter
año
to
en
baby
la
Jesus.
cumbre de Glasgow en
The
Escocia
government is
a
going to
fijar
attend the Glasgow
sus
Summit
metas,
in
pues, y
Scotland
sus
to
nuevas metas
set
de
its
descarbonización,
new
a
goals
materializar o a
on
formalizar
decarbonization,
seguramente
most
su
likely
ambición de
to
descarboneutralidad
materialize
en 2050.
its ambition
Y eso va a
regarding
implicar que
net
el
zero
país va a
target
tener
by
que entrar
2050. That means that the
a escoger
country
un camino
will
que
need to
sea
choose a
realista
pathway, a
para poder
realistic
cumplir esa
pathway
meta,
in
si es
order
que
to comply with
efectivamente esa
this
meta
target.
se
If
termina
actually
formalizando.
that target
Mi
is
pregunta
going
aquí, y ahora
to
va a
be
ser el
legalized.
orden inverso,
And my
es
question
en esa
is,
carta al niño Dios
in
de
that
la que habló
letter
Sandra,
to baby
¿cuáles
Jesus that was
serían
mentioned by
esas
Sandra,
solicitudes, esas
which will be those
recomendaciones que
requests,
ustedes le
those
harían al gobierno,
recommendations that
principales,
you
esas
will
dos o tres
present
cosas
to the
fundamentales
government?
que ustedes le dirían al gobierno hay que
Those
tener en cuenta
things
en
that we
esta
should
fijación
tell
de
the
metas para
government,
que
okay,
podamos
as to
hacer
these
una
targets, we have to
electrificación y una
take into
transición
account the following in order to have
realista
a
en que,
realistic
en que puedan
transition
darse
and
los cambios con la
electrification,
oportunidad que se
where
requiere y
we
que no
should
nos
have the
asfixie los
changes
costos
as
de la transición. Si
required and
quieres,
not to be
empecemos contigo,
suffocated
Sandra,
by
para hacer la
transition
orden inversa.
cost. So let's start with you, Sandra.
Yo creo que yo le diría al gobierno
I would tell the
que
government
la energía eléctrica,
that
que es lo que estamos aquí,
electrical
digamos, o
energy,
que es a lo que le podremos
which
apuntar como
is
uno de los
what we are
potenciales
betting
en
on
materia
as one
de
of the
industria,
potentials when it comes to
transporte y de
industry,
consumo residencial,
transportation, and
requiere
household consumption. It requires two things, and here I'm moving out of the internal regulatory framework. They require two things in order to reach those generation sources. And there we do not have clear rules of the game. What we really need is the framework of social policy as to environmental licenses, as to prior consultations. Nowadays, we can have generators, transmitters, people with the possibility of investing, PPA contracts, energy auctions, and the projects are there waiting for prior consultation, waiting for the law on prior consultation, waiting to have an environmental regulatory framework in order to develop these projects. It's amazing, Tomas, that we still have licensing times for small projects, and they take as long as they take for large companies. I do not understand how does that work for renewable energy. If I tell the government the regulatory framework for renewable energy is the adequate one, but what happens to do these projects? To do these projects, we need to solve a problem that is not only related to energy, but it is a cross-cutting problem, and that's the regulation. For example, when we are speaking about connecting a project, then what's the problem? That the line will not get there because there is no consumption. It's not that the companies do not attend or that there is not a clear regulatory framework. When it comes to electricity, for the expansion of the electricity sector, it has one of the most stable regulatory frameworks. I feel pleased when I tell a bank, come and invest in our client's project because you have a reliable market manager, because accounts are reliable. But then the project doesn't get there because we have not been able to overcome what I just mentioned. I don't think that's a matter of the Minister of Energy. It's a country matter. When are we going to decide if we need a regulatory framework for that? So that's one of the topics that I would like to have ready. Another topic on which I would like to have clarity. Just go for one policy, marry with one policy, and please tell me what is it that you want when it comes to electricity, and with which sources. Is it net zero target? Is the government going to incentivize one more than the other? Because I really do not have clarity on that. Well, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you to be very specific, Maria Juliana, which could be your recommendations or requests to the government. I think that Sandra already said what I was going to say. In the projects that we are starting to finance now, the topic of concern is prior consultations and environmental licenses. I mean, sometimes you have the license, and but that not only happens in natural resources, it happens in infrastructure. You can have the environmental license. You can have everything ready. You can have everything ready for the coaching, which is necessary to disperse and draw the resources. But in the middle of the operation, there is a license problem for any reason whatsoever because there is a wetland there. So that lack of legal security really affects these projects. So it's not only the environmental part, it's everything related to prior consultation. This has drained the projects in Colombia. So one needs to think, what do we need to do to give some peace of mind to these projects? As to the household sector, when we are looking at projects which have included sustainability projects, I think that's important not only for the builder, but for other actors. Thank you very much. I would like to ask for two things. First thing is an example. I think that the public sector is the one that must lead that transition. Investment projects, instead of changing carpets or buying China, is to change the fleets of public entities so they will be electric vehicles. I mean, the example plays a very important role. It is the state, the one that should start with these dynamic projects. And the second one is that when it comes to regulation, is to untangle this. I mean, it's to have figures like the aggregator. There are some specific topics in the regulation that have been there for a long time, but we're waiting to solve this in order to move forward in a significant manner. Those are the two things that I will include in that letter to baby Jesus. Yes, as Sandra just mentioned, there is a co-generation process, and it has to do with environmental license, even though the terms of reference are very clear and they cover all of the terms which need to be taken into account. The expedited action is key here, so that things are not left in the middle and we could really accomplish this successfully. Likewise, even though we didn't touch that much on the regulation, on the resolutions regarding the energy license, once again, we go back to the topic related to the agencies, their expedite response in order to obtain these tax benefits. It is important to count on that celerity that is needed, because many times certificates arrive when import terms have expired or when the tax cycle has expired, and I get a certificate of the agency when I cannot become that certificate effective. So it is important for the government to move its apparatus, its system, in order for the agencies to have quicker and more expedite terms.
Solo una solicitud al niño Dios, entonces.
Okay, so only one thing in the letter to baby Jesus. Well, Diana, we're going to close this panel with you. Okay, Tomas, I think that everything has been said, but the expedite-related topic is very important to us in order to make the necessary amendments to the regulation. So hopefully Sandra's wish will be met in order to have the existing regulation, but we need for this to be expedited in order to implement this as soon as possible. That is a priority. And the second one, without any doubt, is more incentives for the access to new technologies and for the assembly of new projects, because there are incentives to commission new projects, but sometimes the amounts are too high. Therefore, it is important to revisit those amounts in order to have access to the benefits and subsidies.
Muy bien.
Well, so thank you very much to each and every one of you. I think that we've seen very interesting and diverse opinions, but I have different takeaways here. I think that today we have seen that there is quite an effort on the side of the industry. We only here have the industry, but we have seen these efforts in other sectors. Nevertheless, acknowledging that there are some ambitious targets, that we need quite an effort to achieve this, and that some sectors like SMEs or those companies that do not count on their own resources, we know that it's going to be more difficult for them. And I think there is a generalized call to complete those regulatory and policy frameworks in order to have a clear roadmap. We've had a clear roadmap when it comes to unconventional renewables, but we are still missing that on the side of consumption, on the side of transportation, which was emphasized by Sandra. We need to fill in the gap, the regulatory gaps that we have. And another request is for the government to help in the funding of these projects in different ways. So thank you very much for your opinions, for your participation. And I think there is a clear message conveyed here. We have quite a challenge ahead of us, and we need to fill in those gaps which have been clearly identified. What we need to do now is to focus on filling in those gaps. So thank you very much.
Gracias.